So to recap Dennis' comments, and you and I are just singing from the same page. Thank you for your comments, because it's really that nuance. Impact does not necessarily mean injury. And on that question of the junior water right and stream conditions at the time of their appropriation, there are conditional water rights that haven't started exercising or haven't started diverting, or absolute water rights. Any number of things that allow people to start diverting again and change that condition. And that will impact that junior, but that does not translate legally to injury. Is that about what you said, Jack? Okay, thank you. And Paul?
Yeah, I think that the Supreme Court's language has been, somewhat, maybe not as precise as it could or should have been over the years, in that when they say maintenance of stream conditions, I think what they're really saying is maintenance of the changed water rights impact on stream conditions, and not maintaining the actual historical, or even requiring the changed water right to divert just as it did historically. But more is just a limit on that specific water rights effect on the stream conditions. And that's what they need to maintain through replacement return flows in time, location, and amount, and not expanding them in some use.
Thanks, Paul. Was there another question over there? Yes.
What's the state's position on consistency of prior change cases? Like oftentimes you will undergo several change cases over multiple years, and a specific study period will be used for multiple cases. States, what's the position on that?
So the question is, what's the state's position on just being consistent with?
Consistent or wanting applicants to expand the study period that actually have additional years after the prior change?
So the question is not just only consistency, what's our position on consistency and sticking with a past practice or a past study period, but as time has passed since the last change, there's another set of years, there's another decade or more of years to consider. And this gets a little bit into the changed circumstances question. And, I think your question can go several different ways. But certainly, if a previous water right was changed up to a certain period, and then we get another set of shares on that same ditch that now comes in for a change, we need to at least look at those years since the last change. And perhaps there was a ditch-wide analysis that was done that can give us good information on this subject water rights use up to that date. But we need to ensure that something didn't change in the intervening years or the years following that would constitute changed circumstances. And we just recently had some direction from the court on at least considering that. So, wide open question. I hope I answered it a little bit. There was one other.
So, you're discussing kind of your interpretation of Senate Bill 183 and what it means to exclude non-decreed use. In that case, your interpretation is what we can determine was divergent non-decreed use, we'll cut it out, just like we went to decreed use. Some large systems, the state engineer is looking at what's diverted at the head gate, sometimes doesn't track what's going on through the entire system, and it gets confused. There's a lot of different uses, some have changed, some are continuing to irrigation, and it's not always clear what's going to what. In those situations where you may have a large amount of water going to different uses and no longer going to the original different use, it's really difficult to determine what's going to what. Would excluding years be appropriate at that point?
So the question is, it goes back to Senate Bill 183, and the question of you really can't use non-decreed use as part of the record of diversions. And so how do we deal with that when it comes to a situation where at a certain diversion location, water is being diverted for several different things, and we can't tell for that subject water right whether maybe it was being used for non-decreed use or just for its decreed use, and would it be appropriate to exclude that here, just to remove the question? So that's I think that's a good consideration. It's such a fact-specific question, because we have to look, is there a way to determine, or do we need to conservatively consider that water right may likely have been diverted for an undecreed use? And I think if there's absolutely no understanding at all of how it was used, maybe it's appropriate if the other years did have good records, it might be appropriate to take it out, but it's very fact specific.
Yeah, I would just echo what Kevin said. There may be years like that where you just can't determine how much was decreed, how much was undecreed. It might be appropriate to exclude it. I think in one of the cases where the Supreme Court touched on this, it was actually, there were a bunch of diversions at an undecreed point of diversion. And some diversions made at the decreed point of diversion. There, it was pretty easy. Those diversions are just excluded. But in your scenario, yeah, it could be quite difficult.
And maybe I'll take one more question, or two more. I saw two hands up, and let's get through those quickly and move on to the next session, so we can all talk with Brett and just really enjoy that.
I just had a question on policy implications of going after water rights after they've been used less, after the representative state kind of scale and reduced. It seems to me that this creates an incentive for people wanting to change water rights to go after virgin unchanged dish systems. A disincentive to try to change the remaining water rights dish systems that have been urbanized. There's remaining share left. And I'm wondering how the state looks at that in the context of buy and buy.
So the question is, does this create, the discussion I'm having, does it create a disincentive if we're going to allow someone to acquire a water right and not act on it for several years and exclude those years from consideration? Does that create some disincentive for, and the converse would be, we do include all years, even in a declining use of a set of shares, is what I heard you say. So that created a disincentive to acquire those water rights. And it seems like maybe you're saying that the last few water rights on a ditch system might reflect diminished use by nature of being the last few water rights.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a ditch system in an urbanized area, there hasn't been irrigation in the past 10 some odd years, but there have been big change cases on that ditch system used in the study period for water that's for use in irrigation. If I was going to buy the water, buy some water rights and want to use those use, I'd be less inclined to buy water rights in the urbanized system. I'm going to buy water rights system that's productive agriculturally, what we can do in those more recent years when they're used. I'm just wondering if the state, the engineer's office has considered that policy ramification in how they've been prosecuting water rights.
Well, so without restating the detail there, I just want to say probably a good measure in that situation, those shares are still going to have a parcel specific record that really reflects their historical use. And if it did decline over time, that is part of that water rights represented in the study period. So hopefully I didn't shortcut that question with too quick an answer, but I think if you're advising a client, that's what you would look at. It's still going to have a period record that needs to be considered. Now, as far as how that impacts an attempt to go after larger systems that have not been engaged in changing, we're really looking at doing the right thing from a technical perspective and an administrative perspective. And I know there are lots of discussions on alternative transfer mechanisms and other things. We don't feel that we would be encouraging buying and dry just by taking the right approach on this. So, last question.
Kevin, can you elaborate a little more on what the change circumstances are, what you feel those, if you can elaborate on maybe details or for example?
Well, so the question is, can I elaborate on what changed circumstances are? I think going back to the previous question we had. And again, I'm going to be more general on that. Did the circumstances, and let's go back to the case where there was a ditch-wide analysis done, but only a subset of shares were changed in the previous case. So a new set of shares coming in has the benefit of that ditch-wide analysis, but 1 or 2 decades has passed since then. What changed circumstances could we possibly be considering that would influence our decision whether to include those years? And I think in general, after that big long setup, I think my answer is going to be disappointing in general, but did the irrigation practice change? Were some of the lands that had been irrigated no longer irrigated during that period? Was there something substantial that says, okay, you no longer were practicing your irrigation the way you were when this ditch-wide analysis was done? So that's sort of a general answer. So I'm going to stop right there and hopefully we can have more discussion.